Let me invite the scientists up. Dr. Guliuzza, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Clarey, come on up. All right. That's in case they want to Google, you know. Yeah. Now, if they touch that computer, y'all are going to be like, see, there you go. Yeah, okay. So just so you know, the response we had to the Q&A was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for everyone who put a question in. That's the best part. The worst part is that there's just no way we could get to even half of these questions. And so I'm actually working with Judy. We'll be keeping the questions, and she's actually looking at answering these questions on our website. So if your question doesn't get answered, don't fear. It's probably going to be put on the Denver Society of Creation website in a little bit. So don't worry. All right, these are in no particular order, and it can be for a specific scientist or just anybody can answer. And sorry about that. Forgot to give the president a microphone. Oh boy. Well, it was a good first event for Dave. Okay, here we go. All right.
No questions.
All right. So this is what. Sorry, I cracked myself up. All right. So this is an interesting one, and I wanted to start out with it. Is there anything in the Bible about neurological sciences? And this is the fun part. It says, also, how does one come to work at ICR? Sincerely, future neurosurgeon. So
That might be for you.
is there anything in the Bible you can think of that talks about neurological sciences?
No, not right off the top of my head can I think of anything that's going to talk about neurological sciences. I'm zeroing in on a young woman, maybe that's who asked this question along those lines. And you want to be a neuroscientist, or did it say neuroscientist or neurosurgeon? Neurosurgeon. Oh, better yet. That means you're a physician. So there's no age limit to come to work for ICR, but in terms of our science staff, we are looking for people with a terminal degree. And an MD degree is like the pinnacle of all terminal degrees on that. So I think in this particular case, you would be a shoo-in because you would have demonstrated that you have a thorough knowledge of a lot of areas and that you're really, really smart. And so that would be great. My recommendation is, if you want to do a neurosurgeon, that means you have to get into medical school as well. So I was talking to you during the break about maybe getting into one of the graduate programs. There would only be one other thing I would add in terms of getting into med school that's a little bit different than getting into a graduate program. Of last year, they had 60-some thousand people apply for the 20,000 slots at med school. So it's not totally exclusive, but it's a highly exclusive area. What are they looking for? They're looking for people with good grades, good MCAT scores, that's a medical college admission test scores, but they're also looking for people who are interesting and rounding out their class in that area. So my recommendation to you to become a really, really interesting person that they would want, and they can't ask you questions, by the way, it's off limits for them during your medical school interviews to ask you questions about abortion or gay rights or any of those kinds of things. Those are off limits, but they'll ask questions around about. So you need to clarify to them that you have lived in a world full of people who have diverse views than you, and you're able to love them, and you're able to know them and accept them. That's what coming from a Christian background, that's what they're worried about. They're worried about that you'll get into their class and you'll sound very, very judgmental to their gay person. So they don't want that. You have to show that you are a person who can see gay people and still love them and still know them. And in fact, this happened to me. My last name is Guliuzza, and I got assigned for all of my rotations with Diane Gutatsky. G-U-T. Diane Gutatsky was a flaming hot lesbian, outspoken lesbian all the way. Every other word out of her mouth was lesbian on that. And I ended up on all of my assignments with Diane Gutatsky. And at the end of my second year, I got the Mr. Congeniality Award for being a lover of even Diane Gutatsky. And everybody was assuming that this conservative Christian and Diane would be at each other's throats. And I never let that happen. So you have to demonstrate that you can live in a world, even people who have diametrically opposed views to you. The second thing I'd recommend that would really be good to getting into med school is, as an undergraduate or even in your master's program, if you go that before you go to med school, is get a scientific paper written. Even if you're just a co-author on a paper, that is a huge score in terms of making you interesting. So that's my recommendation for that.
Excellent. All right, here's another one. Dr. Thomas, you might need this one. It says, how are the expected decay timeframes for soft tissue determined in fossil specimens? Do the calculations utilize the half-life decay of C14 within the tissue, or some calculated form, and I'm going to mess this up, of the Arrhenius equation, temperature versus reaction rate, or both?
Great question. So we use the Arrhenius equation to calculate the kinetics, the decay rate of a particular protein. So we've done it with collagen because it's the most abundant bone protein, and it's the most likely protein that you would find in a fossil bone, and it's a protein that has been discovered and characterized and sequenced in fossil bones, including dinosaur bones. So what you do is you have to come up with some technique that measures the integrity of the molecule as it decays over time. And then you have 3 different temperatures, and you measure the decay rate in 1 temperature, a second, and then a third. And the experiment takes about 3 months to run, and we do these at high temperature in order to simulate, in order to accelerate the aging process. But if you do it at these 3 temperatures, you can then use the data that you derive from those decay rate curves, and you plot those onto an Arrhenius plot. This gives you a straight line that gives you everything you need to know to determine the kinetics. So it's Arrhenius equation on that. And so anyway, that's all in my thesis that's on the table here, and you can learn more about Arrhenius equation, one way that it's applied there. But it's, I mean, we all remember Arrhenius equation. I mean, my mom taught it to me. I mean, when I was like 5. After I learned calculus when I was 4, I went right into Arrhenius.
It was a nursery rhyme, wasn't it?
I remember PV equals nRT.
And then as far as radiocarbon, that's a completely different substance. And so we're looking at nuclear decay, not a chemical reaction. So the reason we do 3 different temperatures to measure the decay rate of collagen is because it's based on a bunch of different chemical reactions. The hotter it is, the faster those reactions take place. So if you find a bone and it's in a perpetually hot place, chances are you might not find as much protein in that bone. But if you find bones from Canada and Alaska that have been cold since the flood, you might have better looking organics inside those types of samples. So if anyone has bones from Alaska, holler at me. And then the radiocarbon is a different process. It uses a different formula, and it's based on the nuclear decay of radiocarbon as it turns itself into nitrogen. The half-life is really well characterized, and I don't know how they measured it, but I guess back in the day they used Geiger counters or something. But I trust that they got the right measurement on that.
Perfect. That kind of made my brain hurt. Okay, that's good. That's awesome. All right, Dr. Clarey, you don't get out.
Well, this is like Joe Biden. He already showed me the question. So I've been thinking about this one. So. Did I say that out loud? I'm sorry.
It's not a hard one. It's that's why I showed it to him. It says, what are areas of Colorado that we can, sometimes I can't read them. Basically, that you can see the evidence of the plate tectonics in Colorado, like Red Rocks, Flatiron, that kind of stuff.
Well, I think the whole Front Range, or basically all the Rockies in general, are evidence of catastrophic movement, catastrophic uplift. Late in the flood year, most of the mountains popped up, about 8% of them, including the Rockies, the Andes, the Himalayas, all these kind of came up as kind of equilibration, like I talked about, I think, briefly in my talk. I want to maybe in between talks. But you have all this rapid uplift that took place as the waters were receding. And that's where you get all these rocks folded up, just like you see on the Front Range, all these folded up tilted sediments, whether they're on an angle or they're vertical, like you see down at Garden of the Gods, but some of them actually turned over all the way. It depends where you're at on the Rockies. But the whole Rocky Mountains are kind of an enigma in some ways because they're so wide compared to like the Andes. And other mountain ranges are very narrow right along the subduction zone. And there's different ideas about that. And it does seem to have some validity that there was some sort of a lower angle subduction going on. And part of that's because what happened with North America is it ran over a divergent boundary, ran over an ocean ridge. So you notice the ocean ridge comes up the Pacific. If you look at your world map, comes up the Baja of California in between that little area, and then it disappears, goes into North America. And it comes out again over by the state of Washington and Oregon. And in between it, you have the San Andreas Fault. But what happened to that ridge? It's tucked away underneath. So the ridges, because there's such buoyancy and a lot of magma coming up, didn't seem to sink very deep. And so it kind of banged along the bottom of the crust, pushing up mountains a little bit wider, spreading out the Rockies a little more than most. And I think even some of that magma might have generated the magma activity you see at Yellowstone during the flood, the supervolcanic eruptions that took place. So it's kind of a complicated mountain range compared to most, but you can see that just by looking out your window, and you can see these uplifts that pushed up very, very rapidly in the flood, and the erosion as the water was receding took off all the sediments on the top and carved right down to the basement rocks, the granites like at Pikes Peak, which is probably original Creation Week rock. And some of the other cores of your mountains here are contorted and highly metamorphosed, and you see these banded rocks, and a lot of that's because of all the activity that was taking place as these plates are moving fast. And it was even the basement rocks show scars from the flood, and you can see a lot of that. But they folded up a lot of these sediments before they became truly lithified rock, and so they were still wet. And you're able to fold rocks much more easily when they're just packed down sediment versus solid rock. Engineers know you can't fold rock; it just crumbles.
Even
and
engineers.
So you've got to, yeah. No, I didn't say even engineers. Even medical doctors. Even medical doctors know you can't fold rock because he is an engineer and he's had some geology. So.
All right.
But that was a good question.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Guliuzza, let's do this one. It says, could the flood have overwhelmed the CET abilities of many organisms, leading to mass extinctions after the flood?
Oh, yeah, you bet. That's an easy one. And that's allows me to explain some things. Just because organisms are able to continuously track environmental changes does not mean that their ability to change is unlimited in scope. This is an engineering-based model, and like all engineering-based models, it goes under the assumption that everything has design parameters. So this table, it's designed well, but nobody's going to expect us to put 10 tons on this table and have it hold up. It will fail. Once you exceed its design limitations, it will fail. And that's an engineering term to say that it fails, but to say that the table failed when its design limitations were exceeded is not to say the same thing that the table was poorly designed. Just because something fails does not mean it is poorly designed. It means that it was exposed to a condition which exceeded its design parameters. And that is the same thing for creatures. One, it's the rate of change. Organisms are able to track changes, but if they're exposed to a condition that greatly exceeds on a short time frame their ability to adjust, then their systems will fail. Or two, if they're just exposed to conditions which in and of themselves exceed the design parameters, they will fail. And none of that indicates by any means that the Lord's designs are poor designs. It just means that they were exposed to conditions which exceeded that. So clearly the flood, because there's billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. Man alive. I played that for my kids, and my 5-year-old son sang it till I have it memorized. Anyway, they clearly overwhelmed their design parameters all over the place, and it can still do so to this day. And we even see organisms and populations of creatures going extinct today because they are exposed to conditions, usually loss of habitat, which exceed their abilities to adjust.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to give one to Dr. Clarey, and then I'm going to throw one out there for anybody. It says, how does the so-called KT layer fit into Earth's history and the supplied, wait, I should have rewritten some of these, and the supposed cause of dinosaur extinction? The KT layer, how does the KT layer fit into Earth's history?
I assume whoever wrote this is referring to the little clay layer they found over in Italy. But they initially found what they claim is a high iridium signature in that particular clay layer. But it is kind of spread out over, as they go down. They found it in many other places as well, and they claim that's the evidence for part of the evidence for the dinosaur extinction with this asteroid story. But you go to Montana, and it's in the literature, you can find the KT iridium at the KT boundary in one place. Go to the next hill, it's not there. And so it's not as universal as it's made out to be, even though you do find it. And it's just a signature of a rare earth element. Iridium is also, which is what they were talking about, is also found in volcanic eruptions. There's a lot of volcanic eruptions that were happening towards the peak of the flood in the Cretaceous. We see the reason why you guys have so much problems with your soils around here and in Texas is because your soil is filled with volcanic clays, volcanic debris that was going out during the flood, and then when they get wet, they swell and they compact, and so you guys have a lot of issues. I remember when I lived in Colorado with basements around here, some of the walls can actually collapse and crack because of that heaving, and they try to keep your you try to either keep it all wet all the time or dry all the time. I don't know what the current theory is out there, but there's issues with that. The same thing happens in Texas. They have no basements in Texas. All these tornadoes and no basements because they just can't build them because the soil is even worse down there. But that's all part of volcanic eruptions, and there's iridium in many of these. And as I mentioned in my talk, the so-called smoking gun, this asteroid that hit supposedly the Yucatan Peninsula area, kind of the edge of it, when I looked at the oil wells and the cores down there, there's only 2 out of about 12 that shows any iridium. And so there should have been lots of iridium at the, again, where's the smoke from the gun? If that's the barrel where it hit, where's the smoke? And so that iridium layer, it's interesting, but it can be explained away, again, as volcanic eruptions as well. Volcanoes produce iridium. We know that's the case. And so there's a lot of paleontologists that aren't really well known and don't get their voice out there because the asteroids sound so cool and flashy, but there's a lot of people, even Dr. Bob Bacher, that say it can't be because it would have killed everything. And he sees, frog fossils grow right across the KT boundary, which is now called the KPG, by the way, because they changed the tertiary to the Paleogene and Neogene. And so we try to confuse people as much as possible. So if you hear KPG or KT, that's the Cretaceous, Tertiary or Cretaceous. He hates these names. Paleogene boundary. But it's really the end of the Zuni, the end of that 5th sequence, I think was about the high point of the flood, and then you went over the top. But the iridium there's nothing magic about iridium, nothing magic about that boundary because it's not everywhere. It's in it here, there, and it doesn't even show up at supposedly the site where that asteroid hit, which, again, I believe if it did hit, was much smaller because there's not enough melt, as well as not enough iridium.
Awesome. You could put those names in a song, and his son could sing it to him.
That's what we probably should do. I agree. Well, people complain that, you guys use these terms and we don't know what you're talking about, and I agree. It's hard to find can we use them or not? So we try to put in parentheses a little bit more, try to explain what they are. We're not trying to sound smart and overwhelm you with terminology, but it's unfortunately part of the terminology in geology is you kind of have to know where you are. And I'm familiar with it. I know most of you aren't, but you do hear about the KT or KPG a lot. So that's
all right. This is one for anybody who wants to give their thoughts on it. It says, There are many Christians who believe the earth is flat and use evidence that water seeks its own level. With the earth being 2/3 water, how can the earth be proven to be somewhat spherical through scripture or good biblical science?
I think we should ask Joel that.
That Anybody?
Our beloved president can answer
So I think we should all say something,
that. Yeah, I agree.
maybe.
For yourself.
Well, I remember getting in a plane. You know, you look at the night sky and you could see the positions of the constellations. And then I flew to Iceland, and I was able to see stars on the north side that I had never seen before. And that's only possible on a spherical Earth.
Satellites. How you find yourself here, you need, your satellites are using GPS, they're stationary satellites, so you gotta have satellites, and so, the people have asked, that's kind of a big thing with the flat earth for the last, 8 or so years, people have been bringing it up, but, it's just, there's too many things that we use every day that shows the earth is a sphere, and it's very spherical in shape, and so we as ICR, we kind of chose not to address that in most of other creation ministries have addressed that and written books on it, but we chose to spend our time doing our other research and things instead. But it's an idea that's out there all too common and kind of unfortunately.
It says, since Dr. Clarey's book, Dinosaurs, Marvels of God's Design, has there been any additional information found from soft tissue specimens which might help clarify the question of whether dinosaurs are warm or cold-blooded or somewhere in between?
No. You want to add anything on any soft tissue? Any DNA snippets that they can? I just thought I'd ask the expert on that. But there hasn't really been, there's been things like eggs, which I think I might have stuck in there where they show the eggs take 3 to 4 months, 3 to 6 months to develop. And again, there hasn't been anything really groundbreaking on either side, in my opinion. As Dr. G mentioned, the feathers, they try to argue the feathers, but I think the feathers aren't really feathers, but they're always trying to make them there. But again, one of the things that I think that maybe I didn't emphasize well enough in my book was the brain shape and the brain size of dinosaurs shows to me that they match up with cold-blooded animals today. They don't have the same shape that birds would have or a warm-blooded animal would have. But there's a few other little small things that I could put in there. They're actually finding now that some dinosaurs, the latest, about a year or two ago, during COVID, it's all a blur. I released a report that shows that the reason there aren't so many dinosaur eggs is some of them might have laid soft eggs, which again fits with some of these cold-blooded reptiles today that lay soft eggs, like some snakes, where they kind of more of a, they're not a really hard shell like we see in bird eggs, that they're a softer eggs, and that's why many dinosaur eggs don't preserve well in the fossil record because they were soft eggs. To me, that kind of implies, and that's something new, that shows that they're more likely cold-blooded again.
Well, let me say one more thing. The Komodo Dragon? Heard the Komodo Dragon? So it's got it has 2 gears in its metabolism, so it can gear down, and it can be in California chill mode. But then if it sees you, it gears up. And other reptiles, if an alligator chases you, it has a burst of speed, but it's a flash in the pan. And if you're a certain distance away, you can outrun it after he is spent. But not the Komodo dragon. It just keeps coming after you. So it got biologists curious about how does it keep running after you. Well, it has a second gear, and its metabolism kicks in, and it almost switches into a warm-blooded type of mode. So, we don't even know, and we just found that out. So we don't even know the metabolic structure of a lot of creatures that are alive and measurable. So for us to speculate about creatures that are extinct, I think it's very difficult indeed.
That's good. Yeah. All right. Dr. Guliuzza, this is a question that came in. What causes a reaction in plants that change the chemical structure in response to the slugs, as they have no nervous system, much less a brain to respond?
Okay. You're right. They don't necessarily have the nervous system like we would have, but they have other communication systems within the plant itself that are using chemical signals. And in fact, our nervous system uses chemical signals as well. And it's using the chemical signaling within that, and this is, I can only get so much in the talks. This allows me to clarify the whole idea of a trigger, And from an engineering perspective, a trigger is always an element which is part of the entity. So if you have a gun, you will have a trigger on it. And if I were to assign you to design a gun, you would put some kind of triggering mechanism on it. So a trigger is always something that is part of the main entity, the true trigger. And two, a trigger is always some type of sensor, a sensory type of thing. So in this scenario where you have the snail slug slime there, or the snail slime, either one of them in this particular case, that in and of itself is not the real trigger for the plant. That is a condition. It's a variable. It's either there or it's not there. And that is how an engineer would look at it. It's a condition of the environment that's either there or not. But the true trigger of something is always a sensor which is attached to the entity itself, and that is the true trigger which will initiate the physiological processes within, in this particular case, the plants or within an animal. And there is some sensor on these plants, and I don't know of any paper that I've seen so far that has identified what the sensor is. It will be identified, but I don't know of it off the top of my head, that initiates a chemical process within the plant, which then, in this particular case, would lead to an unwrapping of certain portions of the DNA, which would expose it for expression of the protein response. So that's how it works.
All right. Dr. Clarey, again, please explain the current circular reasoning that evolutionists use for dating fossils and presumed rock layers in the geological column. You probably touched a little bit on that, but if you could.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Dr. Brian's really good at that too. But anyway, I'll try to go through it. A little bit what happens is, again, you define the boundaries, these different layers originally, that all these crazy names, like Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, were all defined based on changes in fossils. And so they were first looking at them over in England, so they're kind of European and English style names, and that's why they got these, Cambridge for Cambrian and Ordovician for the Ordovite tribe that the Romans conquered and things like that. They used to live over there, that sort of thing. But when the fossils would change enough, they said, oh, this is a new layer. And they started saying, oh, these are, old time frames from people who lived, just like when you dig in archaeology, you can see the different levels where people lived and kept rebuilding and built a new city and built a new city and built a new city. So they started getting this idea that these were earlier times. And this is about the same time in the 19th century that Darwin's theory came out. So they're trying to push the Earth old. So they have like the two pillars that you need for evolution to occur. You need a lot of time, and you need, evolution. To give evolution a chance, has to have a lot of time. And they kind of hide behind that shroud of deep time and say, well, it could happen, but, as we know, it didn't. But nonetheless, that's kind of how they date things based on the fossils. So if they find another fossil layer that has the same suite of fossils, they'll say that's the same age. It was deposited at the same time. And then they can use that then to date the rocks if you find the right type of fossils. So if you find a T-Rex, you'll say, oh, that's Upper Cretaceous. That's where it was found. But it's possible you could find T-Rexes in earlier rocks, so maybe we're wrong. It's not always in that same level. And they do adjust that once in a while. But it is kind of circular reasoning because you can date the rocks based on the fossils they're found in. And you date the fossils, new fossils that you find then based on the rocks from the fossils you identified earlier. And so you kind of go around this cycle. You really can't get an exact, as they like to call it, absolute or radiometric date of most sedimentary rocks that's very accurate. So they have to use the fossils to tell where you are. And it does work to some respects because there was a organization to the flood, ecological zonation. So as you bury different environments, you're going to get the same fossils pretty much globally at the same time. As you build the rocks more and more, you got different fossils, different things, different critters show up as you go up the rock record. So there is some validity to it, but it's not always perfect. But it is a little bit of circular reasoning because you date the fossils based on earlier fossils you identified in that same layer. And so it's kind of a You're using the fossils to do the same thing twice, and it goes around and around. But they've been correlated pretty well. There's pretty much I believe there's a fairly consistent global pattern because it was a global flood. And so you see a consistency in the fossils and in the rocks in a lot of ways because it was a global flood.
All right, wonderful. Dr. Thomas, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, I have a question for you.
Otherwise.
Okay. How do you deal, I'm giving you this one because I know that you've dealt with this recently, and I loved what you said about it. How do you deal with a rude or belligerent evolutionist?
Or creationist.
Well, that's really for Dr. G, but okay, so 2 nights ago I had dealt with a belligerent evolutionist and you saw it, and I assume since you're asking me the question that you thought I did all right. Otherwise
Yes.
you wouldn't be asking me the
Yes.
question. Okay, because I wasn't sure how well I did or not, but anyway, yeah, rude and belligerent, and it was during a Q&A like this, so he just, there was no listening involved, it was just spouting, and so yeah, very difficult. So at one point I just talked over him, and I had to say, look, if you want to organize your event to have your talking points and go through your spiel, you are free to do that. Right now this is our event, and this is an open time for questions. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I had to resort to something like that, just to keep civility around. But afterwards, and it was a sort of a tense exchange there, a little bit. But then afterwards, a visitor from the street said, you know, I think it's more important, and I don't even know if this guy's a Christian. I kind of doubt that he's even a believer. But he said, it's more important that you have a calm and, and kind demeanor than that you even have the right answer. And so I said, okay, I'll work on having a calm demeanor. He said, oh, no, you did. You were calm. So that was encouraging. Maybe that's the ticket.
And you also talked about evolution as a religion at one point. Do you remember talking about that?
Sure. I mean, so why was he belligerent? Why was he so defensive and so vehement in his response? So much so that he didn't care about anyone in the room. Disrespectful to our time, and and didn't want to listen, and all that kind of stuff. Well, obviously we touched on a nerve, right? And so we touched on his core beliefs. So his core beliefs are, natural selection is my substitute God, and you are not gonna. It's like in the book of Acts when the whole city came out against the apostles and said, "Diana, Diana," and they're chanting, "How dare you assault our beliefs?" In this substitute God. And so that's what we need to be ready for, and we should expect, and it's called persecution, because only God really deserves the credit for being God, and we should stand for him and be willing to enter difficult situations for him.
Thank you. I think that's important because we can encounter evolutionists that just yell and scream, and we can be intimidated, but it really helps for us to understand that, hey, this is their religion. This is an emotional response, and so we need to be understanding to them, but also understand how we can still reach out to them. So thank you for that. As we kind of wrap up, I know that we're running a little bit long probably, but just a last few questions. Dr. Guliuzza, this is one you probably touched on a little bit, but maybe I wanted to give you a little bit of time to expound on it. It says, what might be the best type of either experimental or observational test which might demonstrate whether CET versus natural selection, sort of creation in parenthesis, natural selection, is the more correct understanding of how DNA functions within a changing environment?
Okay. We have two competing explanations for observations. And the one that Darwin came up with, which is actually a worldview, it's a selectionist worldview. And in that, the fundamental thing he changed, and I mentioned during my talks, is he goes from an internalistic view of looking at the organisms to looking at organisms from the environment's perspective. It's an externalist. And that was his revolutionary change to biology, and that is the core belief, and that is the core position for all biological teaching today. It goes from this idea that the environments shape creatures over long periods of time, and it has, and probably just as important, the corollary that we will project onto nature abilities that will mimic that of a real agent. And he did that by scoring not on the word natural, but on the word selection. When he projected onto nature the ability to select, as I mentioned earlier, he projects onto nature both volition and intelligence. And that was the big hurdle that he needed to get over. There are several problems with that, and most of them were discovered within a few years of the publication of Darwin's book. And in fact, the pushback against it was pretty vicious right at the very beginning. In 1861, the head of the French Academy of Sciences just called his whole book nothing but silly personifications of nature, of which he projects onto nature the same ability as if it were man, or by extension, as if it were God. And that is exactly what he's after, because the main thing you have to explain is how did you get all this design without an agent? Another person pushed back and said, and this is also totally legitimate, that his analogy of comparing a human breeder to nature is fundamentally flawed. And that was his initial analogy. In his book, he compares nature to a pigeon breeder. And he was saying that pigeon breeders, within just a short period of time, by selecting for this trait or selecting for that trait, could lead to a huge, could produce a huge variety of pigeons, big pigeons, small pigeons, pigeons with long feathers, short feathers, all different varieties of pigeons by them selecting for traits. Therefore, if a pigeon breeder can get all of this diversity of pigeons within a short period of time, if nature acting as a selector in the same place of a pigeon breeder, on a long period of time, you can get something even completely different from pigeons. The third thing that he added to his selectionist worldview, which most people overlook but is vitally important, is he brought in competition and struggle to the death. He brought in Malthus, and he usually phrased his syllogism in this way. At any generation, there are more offspring born at any one time than there are resources available for all of them. Therefore, there will be a competition amongst the offspring for the resources, and the fittest ones, which can capture the resources, will survive. And by adding this Malthusian ratchet, he was able to give a trajectory to his change over time, because the better ones got these resources, and of their offsprings, the better ones got those resources, and of those offspring, the better ones got those, so that over a period of time, you could go from simple to complex, and you had a trajectory, for, basically an upward improving trajectory, rather than just an oscillation. And that struggle has to be to the death, because you have to get, he didn't know about genes, but he knew about something that was an inheritable substance. You have to get that out of the population. So if this side of the room doesn't have the genes, you have to be eliminated, because if you're allowed to intermingle and reproduce with the fitter side of the room here, the population will never advance. And so death has been and always will be a fundamental feature of selectionism. There will always be this competition. You must eliminate the unfit. They cannot mix with the fit if you're going to have any type of trajectory. So Darwinian selectionism has been and always will be a death-driven worldview, and anybody who says, well, no, maybe it's just differential reproduction, they haven't understood and they don't understand Darwinian selection, because if it's just differential reproduction, you can never get a trajectory towards the group. So these are fundamental things. And in their view, the environment is the substitute agent, which, and I'm using quotes now directly from them, which sees, selects, saves, and builds with the traits over time so that you can get simple to complex creatures. So the environment is the active agent which is actively working on. So you'll always, and this would be my challenge to you till the day you die, the next time you see natural selection, look and see if there isn't some active verb attached to it. A verb like acts on, works on, favors, culls, weeds. Any of those verbs, they will always be there because, as another protester for Darwin says, he treated it as a deification of nature where you have a concept governing a verb in the same way as if you had Baal or Dagon selects, acts on, works on, favors. You have a concept which you project onto it abilities, which is the fundamental basis of idolatry. It's what you believe that statue can do and what you project onto it do, how it can act, work on, favor, or bless you in some way. This is why selectionism, all of these things are the root basis for idolatry, and it's even more basis, it's even worse, or as I would say in chapel, worser than having a statue. Because a statue or something like this I can hold up and you can clearly see, oh, Dr. Guliuzza thinks this can act on. Dr. Guliuzza thinks this can favor. You can see that there's this idol in my hand. Maybe it's a rabbit's foot. Maybe it's a totem pole. Maybe it's something. But Darwin's is even more sinister in that there is not this objective thing. It's nature as a whole, which is harder to pin down. But it's nature which always acts on, favors, and works on things. Why is that easy to push back on? Because it's all magic. It's just an interpretive framework. You see these creatures here, and then you see an environment change, and you see some of them over here living in this environment right there. And it's total magic to just say that they're here because nature acted on or favored them. How would I push back that as an engineer? Well, as an engineer, I would never use these magical terms. So if I have a space shuttle that's coming in through the atmosphere, and it burns up in the atmosphere, which happened over Texas, killing everyone on board, and I have another space shuttle which makes its way through the atmosphere, and I say to you, engineer, tell me why one made it through and tell me why the other one didn't, and you said, well, the atmosphere favored this one, or the atmosphere worked on that one, you would never say such a thing because you would get fired, because engineers don't think like that, because that is nothing but just pure magic. And it overlooks entirely where the operative end is. If I said to you as an engineer, tell me why this one made it through and this one didn't, you would go back not to the atmosphere, you would go back to the space shuttle, and you would analyze the space shuttle, and you would see what went wrong with the space shuttle, and you would analyze where the design failure was, and you would fix the space shuttle, not the atmosphere. Does that make sense? It's the same thing with creatures. So now when I see creatures here, and I see the environment change, and I see some of them living here, I'm not going to use the magical phrase, they were favored. I'm going to look at the creature, and I'm going to look at the traits of the creature. So this is the experimental evidence. What traits solve these problems? And then I'm going to look for the genetics or the epigenetics that underlie these traits which solve those problems, and I am getting to the root issue of how it works and why it works. And that is so what engineering can bring to biology is a lot of clarity and eliminating the magic and the idolatry.
It's amazing that we've been so entranced with mutations and natural selection, and we hear that explanation, we just go, oh, yeah, actually, yeah. It's so logical. So I am actually going to go rogue.
No.
I'm going to answer a question.
Oh.
Yeah. They're excited. Did you see that? That's nice. Thank you. Thank you very much. I may be looking for a job later. Anyway, it says, how does ICR and our own creation groups here in the Rocky Mountain area take this biblical worldview out to our middle and high school students? Could weekend trainings be set up through local churches in the communities to reach teenagers? The answer is absolutely yes. They can be set up, and that's exactly what I do at ICR. That's what Joel, the director of events, does. The other gentleman that's been at the book table with me, David Schmitz, his focus is youth. He works with universities and high schools and youth groups and brings ICR scientists out and gets this information into their hands. So is it possible to do this? Absolutely yes. Grab one of our cards and call us, and we'll make it happen. If we need to bring churches together to make a bigger conference, if we want to come into just a church, if we can get into a school through a group that can sponsor us, we will do it. We would love to do that because we understand that that's where the battle is happening in the schools. And so the answer is absolutely yes. Grab one of our cards and we'll make it happen with you guys. Please do that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, okay, good.
All right. Yeah, great answer,
Anything to
great
add?
answer.
Jimmy and
Perfect
Dan?
answer. No, I wouldn't add anything else to that except the fact that there's other ministries out there too. So I don't mind plugging some other ministries, some other creation ministries, which in addition to ICR also do a wonderful job. There's an event coming up. I saw Carl Kirby is doing one here. It looks like that was an excellent opportunity to train young people, and that's what he'll be doing. And then there's another ministry which we're partnering with called Creation Training Initiative, and it's headed up by Mike Riddle, and his whole ministry is to train people in local churches to train the people in the church. And he does an outstanding job on it. In fact, in my opinion, he's got the best training material out there, even better than ICR's, and he does just a fantastic job.
Definitely. I've actually been through his courses, so they are very good, as you can see. No. All right. So, all right. So wrapping up, because I know Judy's probably looking at her watch right now, but this is one that's interesting. I'll start with this one. It says, why are evangelical Christians, pastors, theologians, seminary students embracing theistic evolution in our time? Is it pride, desire to be accepted, intimidation? What are your thoughts?
Okay, just for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and jump on that because I just wrote an Acts and Facts article on that, and it was called Christian Courage is Imperative, or something like that. They always change my titles. I had a cool title like Why You Need to Be Really Brave and Strong and Stand Up to People, and they just changed it to Christian Courage is Imperative. So, but you know, we never know how we're gonna do things ourselves when we're faced with an intimidating situation. Peter said, "I'll never deny you," and then he ended up doing it. And you never know what's gonna happen when you're faced with a mob, because mobs can be kind of terrifying because they're so unpredictable. Nevertheless, many pastors tell us their heart, so I'm not reading their heart. There was a while where we did a lot of pastor conference every year. We went to Moody's Pastors Conference, all of them, all over the place. And inevitably, I had pastors come up to me at the book table, not one, but many, and they almost said in hushed tones, "You know, I really believe what you're saying here, and I agree with your message." And then the next word is what? But if I said that from my pulpit, the head person on my board of trustees would resign. I'd lose half my people. My giving would plummet. Blah, 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 blah. So they're telling me what's in their heart. They're telling me that they're afraid to teach something which they know is biblically true. So I don't have to say, "You're afraid," because they're telling me they're afraid. Second, there was another one, William Lane Craig, you know, a pretty well-known apologist. He just came out in an interview with Sean McDowell. He said, "I am absolutely afraid that the young earth position would be right. I'm afraid that it'll be right. Therefore, to cut to the chase, I will call Genesis 1 through 11 mytho-history, with a more emphasis on the myth." And then another leader of a major creationist ministry told me face-to-face when I talked to him about natural selection, he said, if we say we don't believe in natural selection, first of all, I don't like the term believe in. If we say that we don't believe in natural selection, here was the kicker, What will people think of us? What will people think of us? So I've had multiple occasions where people, I don't have to say, I'm God, I'm reading your heart. You're telling me your heart. You're telling me that you're afraid of what people will think on all of that. So the bottom line is, the main reason, and I think it's biblical, is fear of man. Fear of man. Fear of what they're going to think about you, fear of what they're going to say about you. It is a fear of man. And the Bible commands us not to be afraid. I don't know how many times you could do a study. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Which means it's not a personality trait, which people on this side of the room are courageous, and you're a bunch of cowards. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It's not that some people have it and some people don't. It's an act of the volition. When the Lord says, don't be afraid of them. Don't let their fear, don't let their looks intimidate you. Don't do these things. He's saying it's something that we can make a choice to do, to not be afraid of them. So, what does all that mean? It means that doctrinal purity from the pulpit isn't enough if you don't have the courage to speak the doctrinal purity. That means the next time you're interviewing a pastor, sure, ask them about the Trinity, ask them about their doctrinal purity, but here's the next question you need to ask. What have you done in the last year to demonstrate that you don't have a fear of man? That would be a great question, because that is just as important as the other things. What have you done in the last year to demonstrate that you don't have a fear of man? That is really what we need in the church today.
Wow.
Here comes Judy.
Uh-oh.
Judy, come on up. We're going to end there. That's too good of an answer right there.
This is a great question.
That was a great answer. Thank you, Dr. Guliuzza. I just want, I've been given a lot of credit up here, and I want to make sure that you all know that there were so many people and so many volunteers who came together to make this a success, and I just would like to take a few minutes to thank them. First of all, to ICR, to our speakers, to Dave Napier, who did a wonderful job of coordinating. Also known as Dave 3, and also Dave 2, and Joel. So thank you to all of you. I'd also like to thank all the volunteers from all of the 4 creation groups from the Front Range who came together to support this. And finally, I'd like to thank all the folks here at Shepherd of the Hills who have done just a wonderful job. We got a lot of credit for bringing in some of the audiovisual equipment, but it was actually Adam and Toby and Steve here at Shepherd of the Hills who had to integrate it all with their systems. And they did just an outstanding job. And I think Shepherd of the Hills has been a wonderful host. And I'd also like to thank Rich Cloud, the president of the Pikes Peak Creation Fellowship, for being our Master of Ceremonies. He was kind enough to do that. He did a great job. So thank you, Rich. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to our Lord, who, through all of our trials and tribulations, brought this together and helped us to have a successful conference. Thank you to all of you for attending. Some of you came from long distances, and we appreciate that very much. I hope the conference has blessed you. I hope you've learned a few things, and I hope it has deepened your faith in God and in His Word. So would you pray with me now? Thank you. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. God's blessing on your safe travels on your way home. Thank you so much.